To wrap up our discussion on financial strategy, we're going to talk about performance measures. So using overall financial performance using return on assets is just one way to measure success in retailing. It's the main measurement that we look at, but there are a lot of other measures that help us gauge our success. And part of that is writing some of those financial objectives. So let's talk about a good objective. A good objective has three things. A good objective has a numerical index, a good objective has a time frame, and a good objective lists the resources required to complete your goal. So if you are a retailer and your goal of increased drinkware sales right now, is that a good or a bad objective? That is a terrible objective because it doesn't give us any detail. Now, if we have an objective that says we want to earn $100,000 in drinkware sales in fiscal year 2016 with a $70,000 investment in inventory and promotions, that is a great objective that gives us something to measure. Right? So we have our numerical index. We know that we want to earn $100,000 in drinkware sales. We have a time frame. We know we want to earn that money in 2016, the fiscal year 2016. And we know that it's going to require $70,000 in resources. So that's a great objective. Now let's talk about some of the components we can use to create these objectives. And that would be performance measures. So again, this is a snap from your textbook. So you can see, you can look back and kind of use this chart to help you write some objectives. But the objectives that we look at, they're broken down into input measures, output measures, and productivity measures. And so we've talked about the main productivity measure already, return on assets. And we've also talked about a few of those productivity measures that make up return on assets, such as asset turnover, inventory turnover. And so we use those when we're looking at our overall strategic profit model. But let's talk about other measures that we can use to determine success. And let's start with output measures, because that's first on our chart. Output measures assess the results of a retailer's investment decision. And so these are things we look at like sales revenue, gross margin, profit margin. These are a lot of our financial measures. And so if we're looking generally, those are some things we would look at. What are our sales? What are our profits? Are we meeting enough sales to cover our costs? Are our sales growing? Are we comparing sales from store to store if we're a large chain? Or do we have some stores performing worse than others, better than others, etc.? So those are all output measures that we look at, and they generally focus on financial performance. When we look at input measures, we're looking at the resources or money allocated by the retailer to achieve outputs. So some of our input measures might be, for example, square footage. So that's an input measure. When we talk about how we allocate our resources in order to achieve some of our net sales, right? So if we want higher sales, maybe we will have a larger square footage space where we can hold more inventory and therefore sell more inventory and therefore make more profit, right? So an input is a resource that we're putting into our retail establishment in order to generate an output. Another input might be our number of employees, right? Employees cost money. So maybe we have fewer employees, so we have to pay less in salaries, and so we can generate more sales. Or maybe we want really great levels of customer service because we think that will increase sales, and so therefore we increase our number of employees. It's an input, it's a resource we put into our retail establishment in order to generate an output. Okay, so some other things in there are markdowns, which we'll talk about when we get to our pricing chapter. Are we going to have sales and discounts? That is a resource we put forth. Our advertising expense to bring people in. The expenses we put on utilities, that could be an input. So all of those are resources we use to generate an output. And then the last is our productivity measure, which is a ratio of an output to an input. And that determines how effectively we're using our resources. So based on our output, are we using our inputs productively? That's what we're looking at. And so we can look at a few of those on here, and we'll talk about a lot of these as we work through some of our future chapters. But sales per square foot, that's a great measure, a great productivity measure. And it takes our input of our square foot of store space and our output of net sales, and it shows how much inventory is being sold based on store space. And so that helps us measure performance among stores or among competition. If we know how big, if we have 10 stores and they all vary in size and we want to compare how well they're performing to each other, we can look at the sales per square foot of store space. We can also look at sales per employee. This measures employee productivity. So it takes our input of number of employees and our output of net sales, and we can see how much sales we're generating, how many sales dollars we're generating per number of employee. So all of these are great ways to measure productivity of our retail establishment. And like I said, you'll see us come back to these as we get into some of our chapters, as we start talking about those 6 Ps, product, price, place, promotion, people, presentation. You'll see a lot of these inputs and outputs put together to come up with some of these productivity measures to show how successful we are. So I want you, something for you to think about. Consider a few of the different types of retailers that we've talked about in this course. Maybe it's super centers, or maybe you want to look at department stores or specialty stores or category specialists. Which performance measures do you think matter most to some of these different types of retailers? If you were a convenience store, what inputs, outputs, and productivity measures would be important to you? If you are a category specialist, what's most important to you? So we're not thinking about this in terms of retailers by name, such as Target or Costco or Macy's or 7-Eleven, but we're thinking of this more generally in terms of types of retailers and productivity measures that they might use to measure success. This concludes our discussion on Chapter 6. I do recommend that you go back and look through the textbook and practice some of these financial measures. You will need to keep your calculator handy for when you do the third assignment and when you take the exam for the second exam. So the module quiz for this module does not include any math, but the exam will include some math. So you do need to keep that calculator handy. There is an additional practice for this type for the strategic profit model. In the back of your textbook, there's a case on Tiffany's and TJX, and so it will guide you through the steps of doing the math and putting the strategic profit model together. So you have your homework assignment, and there's also that second example in the back of the text that I recommend you use to practice using the strategic profit model, because you will need to know that for the exam, and you'll also need it for your partner project. So as always, post your comments, your thoughts into the discussion board. If you have any questions, post them in the course Q&A, or feel free to email me if it's a more individualistic question. We'll be moving into customer service in the next lecture.